So I think we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning or afternoon, everyone, depending what part of the country you're in. If you don't know me, my name is Annette Maggi, and I'm the Executive Director of the Retail Dietitians Business Alliance. Thanks so much for joining us today for our webinar called Mastering Meal Planning for Your Shoppers, which is sponsored by the Quaker Company and Frito-Lay. And we're thrilled today to have Kelly Thornton from HEB with us. And Kelly, you'll be happy to see we've got quite a few HEB dietitians on the call, so coming to support, I'm sure. This webinar has been approved for 1 continuing education credit through the Commission on Dietetic Registration, and the certificate of attendance will be sent out within 24 hours after the webinar. This webinar is also being recorded, so you will be able to go back and listen to it again if you'd like, or to direct your colleagues to it. It will be available on the RDBA website within 1 week. So I just want to mention briefly, one of the things that's been great about partnering with Quaker and Frito-Lay and their team is that they really are so focused on what information is of importance to you as retail dietitians. And so I am so thrilled that they were willing to bring this topic forward on meal planning, as well as to have Kelly as the presenter, because HEB is doing just some great work in the area of meal planning. So Kelly, thanks so much for being with us today. And I'll turn it over to you to get started.
Awesome. Thank you, Annette. I appreciate it. All right. So I am extremely excited to be joining all of you guys today to talk a little bit more about meal planning. I am hoping that this session, and my intent for this session, is for it to be a place that sparks thought and to create a space to share ideas. We'll be monitoring the chat as we go, so feel free to comment along. And then the objectives for this meal plan or for this session are going to be to understand the value of meal planning for shoppers and why that can be a beneficial offering, to recognize the various levels of support that shoppers may be interested in, become familiar with a variety of meal planning formats, provide an overview of available resources to help you get started, and then also to generate ideas for how to measure the ROI or return on investment to your management team. So to start off with, I wanted to do a little bit of, something a little interactive here. So what I would love to find out is, what does meal planning mean to you? If you just want to respond in the chat, I would love to start it off with a conversation.
So Kelly, you're getting some good comments in the chat. Less stress, a food guide, planning ahead what meals to be cooked during the week for less stress, and guide of what to buy. Creating meals to provide family throughout the week, less food waste, which is a good one.
Love that.
More cost-effective and nutritious options, looking at discounts and getting ideas for weekly meals, ensuring your week is full of balance. I love that.
I love that. What I really like about this is it kind of displays, there's a lot of different responses here, right? So it feels like meal planning might mean something different to all of us. So my next question to follow this would be, how often are we asking shoppers what meal planning means to them? So far, I also can see the chat too. So I'm saying sometimes, probably not enough, rarely. So the idea here is, I think we want to start off here acknowledging that meal plan it's a pretty vague term. Shoppers might use this term to express a lot of different needs. They might use this term meal plan for a lack of a more concise or clear terminology, or maybe because they're struggling to articulate what they're actually looking for or what they need. So you may have shoppers that are bored with recipes that they've been using, or maybe they don't know how to modify those recipes to meet their health needs. They may also be trying to juggle everyday life and looking for faster meal options. You might have customers who are diagnosed with a new condition or allergy and be confused about what to eat, or they might be learning to cook and be unsure of where to start. And then finally, they might really want to be told exactly what to eat, or maybe they want ideas for some meals, but not others. So as you can see, there's a really wide variety of what meal planning actually could mean to that customer. So in order to effectively help your customer and meet their needs, it's really important to understand what meal planning means to them. As I think all of us are very well aware, one size does not fit all when it comes to meal planning. Once you can start to understand why your shopper wants to meal plan and what level of commitment they have for doing that, in addition to any underlying conditions that they may have, you can start to determine what kind of meal planner they are, and then better be able to tailor resources to meet their needs in a way that's going to be helpful for them. So here we have a few different types of meal planners. So you have a type of customer who's a weekly meal planner. So these are going to be customers who typically will map out their meals for the week, get all their ingredients that they need, and then they typically will save the actual cooking for mealtime. So some of the things that might help them the most would be things like quick recipe ideas, a blank meal planning template that allows them to kind of structure where those meals are going to go inside of their week. And then ways to incorporate ready prepared foods for when they're strapped for time. You also have customers who are mini meal preppers. So these are going to be folks that might cook a whole chicken and use it multiple ways, or batch cook certain components for the week, but then they save the bulk of their assembly for the actual day of that they're planning to eat that food. So some of the things that could help them are things like recipes that could be batch cooked, and then also, friendly reminders as to what components make up a nutritious meal. And then you also have folks that are meal planning and prepping aficionados. So these are people who might prep everything they need in advance. And then the idea is that when it comes time for mealtime, they're just going to heat and eat, essentially. So for these customers, what might help them the most could be recipes that are storage friendly and lend themselves well to advanced prep. And then also reminders of food safety. I think this is something that gets overlooked sometimes, and this is still something that's pretty critical for those kinds of customers, right? As you're considering meal planning, some other things to consider are going to be, your cultural preferences. Obviously, if we're providing tools that don't meet a customer's, maybe religious preferences or cultural preferences, they may not use that tool. Health conditions, obviously we don't want to provide customers something that's going to be counterproductive or, that isn't going to be beneficial for the customer. Also, you've got budget, right? If you're recommending something that is outside of a customer's budget and they can't easily identify a cheaper or more affordable substitute, they might not use that tool. And then obviously, again, taste preferences and allergies. Customers might not use tools that aren't appealing to them or that include foods that trigger an allergy. So as you're looking at creating tools that could help you address these different kinds of customers, you can identify these kinds of customers in a couple of different ways. I think in order to do this really effectively, one place to look is to look at what's being sold at your stores and what's being offered at your stores, how they're merchandised, and what some of the really popular items are. A lot of times store leaders can be a really good source of information for this because they normally know what sells. You can also use tools like the CDC's Social Vulnerability Index and then also the census data. These can provide additional demographic information that can help you to start to get a feel for what kinds of preferences your customer might have or what kinds of needs your customer might be facing. Another thing that you're going to want to consider is going to be format. So you have a few different choices for how you can work with customers. You can work with them virtually or on a website. You could work with them at store. You can work with them in a group setting, or you could also work with them one-on-one. We're going to address tactics and ideas for all of these. And I do want to clarify and stress that there's not one best way to reach your shoppers. The best way really depends on your shopper and how they learn and interact. So now we'll get into talking about the individual kinds of shoppers, starting with virtual and online shoppers. I do want to mention that these are tools that you can use with all of your customers, but these are also tools that are great for being posted online, websites, things like that. So virtual and online tools are great for shoppers who prefer to learn on their own time, or at their own pace. So these are shoppers who are often pretty independent and are usually pretty comfortable with technology as well. And then since all shoppers are a little different, posting a variety of tools, again, is a good choice. Some things that you will want to consider, though, as you're building this bank are going to be click pathways. So this is kind of indicative of how easy resources are to find. Every additional click that a shopper completes makes it harder to locate those resources and less likely that they're going to find what they need. Along those same kind of lines, organization of your resources is also really important. So you could ask yourself, could someone at an average reading level and technology level find your tools? And if the answer is no, you might want to reconsider the way that those are laid out for them. And then finally, labeling. So are the labels of your tools and, the pathways to those tools, are those clear? Are they misleading? Are they at too high of a reading comprehension level that might lead to customers getting lost or confused? A couple of other things here to consider are going to be language and reading level. And these are ultimately important considerations for all of our interaction types, but it's especially relevant for virtual and online shoppers since their entire interaction is in print. So like I mentioned on the last slide, reading level is really important as you create, post, and organize these tools. When creating tools, the advice that I always received was to ensure that tools were appropriate for a 7th grade reading level when making something general. Having said that, though, if you are targeting a more educated shopper, a higher reading level would make sense in those cases. Language is also a very important consideration for tools. For the best customer experience, those tools should be fully translated, and that includes anything that those tools connect to. So that could include your overall website, intermediate landing pages, tool labels, all of those things. And so all of this to say, like, if you have a tool that is in another language, but everything leading up to it for the customer to find is in English, that's going to be really difficult for that customer to utilize. And I'll also acknowledge too it can be really challenging to pull all of that, like that customer experience all the way across from the web page all the way to the tool. But it is something that'll help your customer to find those tools. So we have a few ideas for how you could use some of these tools with your virtual shoppers. So we'll start off by talking a little bit about recipe banks. Recipe banks can be really good tools for shoppers looking to try new things. For shoppers that are learning to cook, some recipe banks even have like how-to videos. So like how to cut up a bell pepper or how to cook a spaghetti squash. And these banks are really neat because they're flexible and versatile, and they have filter programming that allows shoppers to choose recipes that meet their taste, budget, or cultural preferences. There are some challenges with these if you have multiple medical conditions, and sometimes there are limited tags available. So things like with renal disease, if you have like renal and diabetes, you might not be able to pick both, or, you might choose one or the other, but it might not work for all of the customers' medical conditions. So there are some limits with this, but overall, for most customers, it is pretty helpful. Obviously, building a recipe bank takes a long time, but you could easily link to an existing site or even a couple of sites for shoppers to use that you really like. Another tool that you could use, and I think this is one that's going to be familiar to a lot of dietitians, is your sample meal plans. So these are your preset meal suggestions. These can be helpful for shoppers with a new disease condition to kind of spur thought and give them new ideas, but obviously, these don't take shopper preferences into account. So shoppers are responsible for researching and conducting their own swaps on things they don't like or can't eat. And that can sometimes be really intimidating for shoppers who don't have a lot of nutrition in education. You can also use these kinds of swap tools. You can pair this with swap tools or swap handouts to help shoppers feel more empowered with those sample plans. And I'll talk more about those in a couple of slides. So this is an example of what that could look like. I think this is something that probably looks pretty familiar to all of us. I think a lot of dietitians, when we think of meal plans, this may be what we see. So the next thing that I kind of mentioned was recipe swap suggestions. So these are tools that can provide suggestions for products that might work better for specific shoppers. So these could be curated for specific lifestyles or allergens. or even more broadly, just to help a shopper swap foods outside of their preferences. So like one vegetable for another, or maybe for one ingredient that they don't have on hand for something else, like buttermilk for milk with lemon, right? These can be built to accommodate multiple cultural preferences. And then I will say that these are not always useful for shoppers that are looking for something that's more direct in terms of an approach, or for folks who really are looking to be told exactly what to eat. The other thing I'll note as well is that these swaps can also help shoppers' efforts to decrease food waste, because again, you could talk about what you've got on hand versus what is the recipe calls for. So this is one example of a swap tool that's here. This is a more generic one, and it basically, again, is kind of a swapping for what you have on hand. We also created a swap tool with HEB we have some that are different for different lifestyles. So one is a gluten-free, and that one, essentially the way we created it is we'll have the common gluten-containing products. So whether that's like tortillas or bread or crackers or what have you, and then provide some suggestions on the other side as to some delicious and tasty options that are going to meet that customer's gluten-free need. So that those can also be really helpful. The next tool that we've got here are going to be alternative meal ideas. So these are going to be places where customers could really think outside the box on what we consider a meal, or even cooking. So some of these would include pre-prepped meals. So these are things like your ready to eat, ready to heat meals. Those can be really great for a shopper who's on the go, or if they've got limited time to cook. Obviously, the limit is that those products might have a higher calorie level, and then they may also be limited for certain medical conditions or lifestyles or allergens. And then, we also have things like snack meals. So these are places where I think sometimes people see snack foods like they could only be a snack. And the reality is, if you up the portion a little bit, those could also become meals there too. So for snack meals, these can be really helpful for shoppers who are busy, who maybe don't love to cook. Maybe they're just not at home very much. You can use tools that are kind of like this one here. I think a lot of us may have seen something that are similar to here. So you've got like a carb, a protein, and then like a fruit or veggie to pair that with, to kind of ensure that our snacking habits are balanced. These can also be crafted to meet a lot of different customers, and they can be crafted for broad cultural preferences too, and for budget constraints. They're just very versatile in general. And they also not only can be helpful in terms of planning for meals, but if you have customers who do like to snack, helping them to plan snacks too, so that they're not reaching for whatever is easy whenever they get hungry at 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Some other resources that could be kind of something alternative in terms of meals, you could consider providing resources that provide basically ideas for using a product multiple ways. These work great for shoppers that are on a budget, and they can also be tailored for different cultural preferences, which is kind of how this one looks. I think this is really cool because you can choose, based on your location, and then you can see different liquids, fruits, vegetables, proteins, flavors that go into this that would make it taste very different depending on what route you took. So I think this is pretty neat. And this is for oatmeal. We also have this example that is oats as breadcrumbs in different ways, but different recipes that you can make with these. So again, taking just one ingredient and using it a lot of different ways. You can also kind of proceed into this alternative meal space with thinking outside the box with different ingredients. So you can use snack foods as recipe ingredients if you're getting a little creative. Maybe you're limited on what you have on hand. So a couple of examples here would be using something like a baked chip as like a crunchy topping, or maybe even like a popcorn, or maybe crushed chips as like a a batter for, cauliflower bites, something like that. So you can get really creative in those spaces. And these would all be really good tools for customers who might be bored with what they're currently eating. And the other thing I think that's really important to mention here with virtual and online shoppers is going to be technology. So technology is your best friend when you're looking for ways to meet your shopper's meal planning needs and requests in a reasonable amount of time. There's a lot of different options out there. There's apps that do basket technology, meaning that you can do like a click to cart where, you fill out a grocery list and it connects to their grocery shopping app. There's also meal tracking and meal planning apps, which I think most of us are familiar with at least some of these. There are also some of these apps that allow for provider collaboration too, which can be obviously really helpful for us. One way that you could use these would be to research some of them and then use them in almost like a review type format for your online customers. So you could go in and break down like what features that app has and like what some of the uses for it could be. I'm really curious, actually, at this point. I would love to know what apps you all commonly use with shoppers and what you guys might recommend. I know some of the ones that I'm familiar with are ones like Mealime, Meal Garden. Yeah, Mealime. There are some grocery store apps too that also will do this, but does anybody have anything else that they want to share with in regards to apps that they use or that they love?
Kelly, I'll just mention that there was an article in yesterday's RDBA newsletter that kind of talked about interesting things happening at retail. And one of the ones I included in that article was Reezers is using an app called Recipe to Table. So I'll put the link to that in the chat if anybody wants to see it, but that's one I've heard of too.
That'd be great. Thanks, Annette. All right. So with that, we'll go ahead and switch a little bit to talk about our in-store shoppers. So engaging with shoppers in store without having in-person interaction can be pretty challenging. Shoppers face hundreds of decisions every time they go into the store. And some of these shoppers go in and they know exactly what they want and what they don't want, and they don't really look around very much. And then you have other customers who might see messaging about tools, but not be willing or able to engage or invest the time to explore those. If you do decide to pursue making tools available at the store, you might consider areas that shoppers might be most likely to look at, or areas that might feel most relevant, or areas that might not have a lot of ads already. Some options around providing those resources in store, it could include advertising or trying to provide those resources directly to customers. So having these things printed and giving those away, or QR codes. You could have those at shelf, at the register, on carts, on shopping carts, or you could even consider something like back of bathroom stalls. You get really creative here. If you do decide to try and engage customers at store, you want to make sure that resources are very easy to take action on. We really love QR codes in that space. And then another thought could be to arrange materials in really visible areas, but that does mean replenishment and obviously more work for you all. This photo actually that I included here is a photo of a standee that we had in pharmacies, and some of our pharmacies for a long time, to advertise our products. So I wanted to include that. You also could do something with group meal planning. So you can consider offering small meal planning classes for small groups by using some of the previous tools in a really structured way. So maybe you're doing something where you're meal prepping everybody kind of together, helping them to create a shopping list and providing tips to them, maybe doing menu planning for the week. And what I really like about this is that I think it would create a lot of autonomy for those customers, which I think is all what we really want to drive for our customers in the end. And then I will tell you that this isn't something that we're doing yet today. So I'm curious if anybody is doing something like this. And then if you are, what kinds of tools you're using. I know it's funny, as Annette, that everybody thought QR codes were not here to stay, but I think COVID really changed that.
Yeah, I would agree. It's amazing where we use them all now.
Yeah, I agree. All right. And then we'll go ahead and move on to individual services. So this is where I think we do a lot of our work today for us. So individual services are great for shoppers who feel like they might need more tailored support or multiple disease conditions or lifestyles that they're trying to manage. Working with shoppers individually really allows us to get to know that patient and truly meet them where they are, and provide them the resources that we think will be most beneficial for that shopper. So as you're getting to know your shoppers, you can ask a lot of open-ended questions to try to clarify what problem they're actually trying to solve. That's especially true if they start talking about meal plans or asking for a meal plan. It's a great idea to kind of dig in the way we talked about before, and saying, what does that mean to you? What tools would be most helpful for you as you're trying to plan your meals for the week, and like really kind of digging in to understand what you can give them that they'll actually use. If they come back and say that they're working on, there's a lot of stuff that they're trying to work on, you could consider targeting the most meaningful thing first. I personally really liked asking customers if there were one thing that if they would want to leave the session with, what that would be. And that can help you kind of narrow down for what they're really, what would be most valuable for them. There are a couple of other things that you probably want to consider as you're working with these shoppers, individually or in groups. So are there items that are on sale or that would add value for the store that might benefit that shopper? So things like pre-chopped veggies or onions, pre-cut fruit. Usually those things are value add for your store. So that could be a really big opportunity for your retailer on the whole. And then obviously it's great for customers because that's time saving. Or are there products that are on sale that would help your shopper to stay in their budget? Or are there prep items that might make cooking easier? So things like onion choppers, blenders, air fryers, stuff like that. And then lastly, and maybe most importantly, are the items that you're recommending accessible to your shopper at their store that's near them? Because if it's not something that they can easily find a substitute, they may either not use the tool or they may go to another retailer to buy that product. All right, so now we'll talk a little bit about measuring ROI. So with ROI, I'll admit that it is a hard thing to measure because most of these meal planning tools are pretty qualitative. I do have a couple of suggestions. None of these are perfect, but they are a really good starting point that you can kind of start to dig down into. So technology exists to measure clicks from QR codes or from website, as we were talking about with the QR codes. You can look into your organization's ability to track click data and then, or search data, and then you can track clicks on the different resources that you've created. So that does mean that you'll have to create a good number of resources up front so that you can see which ones are the most accessed. Instead of researching it first and then doing the work, there could be some work that ends up being not as useful. But it does give really good insight into being able to see what tools are most selected and most clicked on. It also could allow you to spot problems. So if you're constantly seeing that maybe your first option is the most clicked or certain options just never get clicked, it also could be that maybe customers aren't finding it or it's confusing or something along those lines. So it provides good data in that kind of sense. There's also website surveys. I think all of us are probably aware of these, and they're really popular. They are often optional, so customers don't always have to fill those out. You can do like a simple question or two to see the effectiveness of the tools. Two that I see a lot are, what tools did you find most helpful? And then, was this helpful for you? I really like the second one because that's so easy for customers. It's a very simple click and it feels like you would get better engagement with that. But if they answer no, it doesn't really give you a lot of information as to why they didn't find that helpful, which means you'd have to figure out a way to dig more on that. And then for in-person services, you can do a more extensive feedback survey, and also consider how you might capture and review health outcomes for shoppers who use the service over time. So this is it's not easy to do, but it is something that you could use to potentially demonstrate ROI for these kinds of services. All right. So at this point, I'd love to open it up and just get a sense for what other techniques you all have tried, and then what's worked for you.
And Kelly, just so you know, if someone wants to come on verbally and share, if they just raise their hand and ask to, come on and talk, I can turn it on for them and let them talk if someone wants to share verbally what they've been doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not seeing anyone, Kelly, so I don't know if that means no one is currently working on meal planning programs, or if HEB is the only one, or
It could also be that we just covered a lot of different techniques too, and that's okay.
yeah.
What we can do is, I did see some questions in the chat, so we could circle back to those. And then I would love, like I said, to hear from anybody who's had other experiences with meal planning as well. We also have our references here in case you guys wanted to see those.
Oh, good. Well, Kelly, thanks for covering a lot of great information. We can open it now to questions. So attendees, if you want to put your questions in the chat, or as I said, you can definitely raise your hand and I can let you come online and chat too. So Kelly, just to get us started, one of the interesting things, right, is we know we're coming up on January when people tend to get more interested in health. But are there certain times of the year that you have found that shoppers are more interested in meal planning services or education?
Yeah, so I think that what we've seen, I think January is obviously a big time because of the new year, but I think that continues into the spring. And then I also think that we see a bit of a surge with that in like August, September, as kids go back to school. Sometimes there's interest in meal planning, not just for the adults, but also for their kids. That's, I think, where we've seen the most demand for meal planning.
Awesome. We have a couple of good comments and in the chat, Kelly, and I'm going to ask Ellie, I'm looking for you in my, Ellie, I'm going to give you permission to talk, but Ellie brought up this point around that you have to be really careful about allergen data and some of those resources because it's not always real time in her experience. Ellie, do you want to talk more about that?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. It is something that part of my role is to support QA, and I'm chronically concerned at the quality of food data coming, whether it's coming through databases or it's coming from the trade partners and private label trade partners. It's really, really concerning that, and I know that some folks have heard me express this in the past as well. I continue to intercept, class 1 FDA allergen issues, and I'm baffled by it, quite honestly, that that some of this information could be in this condition. So I really encourage everyone. I think we are quite a ways away from real-time allergen information, although of course we want to try to figure out how to support these folks to the best way possible, right? So yeah, it's a tough call right now, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's a really challenging place for us to be in because we do want to support these customers, but then to your point, we want to make sure that the information that we're giving them is as most up to date as it can possibly be. And I do agree with you that product data, I don't think it's real time either. It seems like it doesn't always get updated when they'll make, especially in this COVID world where they'll swap ingredients and things like that. I feel like I see more and more products with disclaimers that'll say that it may not be perfectly accurate because they're having to make those adjustments too.
I feel like I have had to excavate some items because they've used products at store level that are as almost as a sub recipe. For example, for sesame, which we're trying to navigate right now. So, and this is the first time I think retailers have encountered a new allergen to label since we've all really been in this digital space. So you have to backtrack all your data to wherever it is. So I just, again, I think we're a ways away from a clean opportunity for allergens in particular. So, but there's definitely more opportunities coming. So.
Yeah. Thanks, Ellie. I'm going to ask Elaine, I know you mentioned a new tool that Albertsons has purchased. I know if you want to hop on, I gave you permission to talk too, and just talk a bit about that.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh my gosh. Okay, cool. Well, so you mentioned Mealime earlier, and it's a recipe platform, meal planning platform that Albertsons company has actually acquired, I want to say over a year ago. So I was just mentioning that I've had, just a couple preliminary meetings, but I know they have their own dietitians. They're based in Canada, but we haven't had, I haven't had the opportunity to necessarily partner yet. I think they've just been trying to sync with our platform, if that makes sense.
Yeah, all good. Yeah, that's great. Thanks for sharing, Elaine.
Sure.
Anybody else, if you want to come on, just let me know. Kelly, another question that's come up is, meal planning can take a lot of time for retail dietitians, right? And this is the challenge that all of you are pulled in so many different directions. So do you have any tips about making it more turnkey and less time consuming for dietitians to kind of develop resources and programs and offer these services to shoppers?
Yeah, so I think that technology, like I said, technology is your best friend in this space. Depending on what technology platform you're using, some of them will allow you to do things like templates to start. So you're not starting from scratch every single time. You can create templates for all kinds of different conditions. So it could be medical conditions, it could be for calorie levels, it could be for lifestyle. So whether that's vegan, vegetarian, et cetera. And that can give you a jump start, but the personalization still takes time. And I think it's faster than doing something on paper, but finding something like that can be really helpful, I think. If you find technology that's even quicker, then that also obviously that allows you to do that faster. It's obviously really helpful.
Yeah, and Kelly, kind of a related question. And I know right now, like at retail, IT departments are so busy because I think everyone is still trying to improve the online shopping experience and improve their e-commerce sites. I mean, do you have thoughts on, like, if you want to use a tool like that or purchase a tool from a third party, on how to get that through the approval processes? I mean, I know every retailer has a different approval process, but I'm sure just getting IT support on bringing something like that in is challenging. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think having your IT support is important at a point, depending on how the landscape of your retailer is. We've done research ourselves to look and see what the user functionality is for at least some of these systems. And you can kind of do that to start, so you can narrow down how many you want to look at. But when you get into where you're wanting to implement or acquire or something like that, you really do have to get, your legal team, your IT department involved in it at a point. But there is some initial research you could do yourself.
Yeah, and lay out the recommendation and kind of what it would take and those kinds of things. Yeah, for sure. So we have a question on how are dietitians helping shoppers make adjustments for price increases, inflation when food shopping? People may not be able to afford the foods in a meal plan, particularly some packaged food.
Yeah, so I think that would actually be, I would love to hear from everybody on that. If you guys have any thoughts around what you're doing. I just saw in the chat store brand, which is obviously a good option. I think you could also, I think some of those swap type some of those swap type tools could be really helpful. So again, like teaching customers how to swap one type of product for something else, I think is ultimately kind of where that falls. Obviously, you could also do food resources to them too, things like food pantries, WIC, SNAP, all of that good stuff. But I think swaps really are your best friend in those kinds of, for those customers.
Yeah, and Mandy Katz just mentioned that they talk a lot about pantry freezer inventory and building meals around those, which is great advice too, for sure.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah. So we have a question, Kelly, about have you seen any general kind of return on investment data on there out in the, world or space around the benefit of meal planning at retail?
Yeah. So what I've seen is that some of these organizations can provide data around like how many meal plans are distributed. There are some that have some pretty extensive capabilities in the sense of like being able to tell you what's been sent to customers, like on an aggregate level. I think though that there is some level of ownership that we have with retail in the sense of trying to show that ROI for our programs. They'll be able to show the effectiveness of their program up to the point of sending it out. But for us, like there's still a building component that we would have to be able to show, if that makes sense. I don't know if that answered the question, but if not, I can keep going.
Yeah. Marilyn Mills has a suggestion or just sharing some information on what they do at Hannaford. Marilyn, I gave you the ability to talk. Do you want to go ahead and just provide the group with an overview of that, what you mentioned in the chat? Marilyn, are you there? Maybe she's having some technology on her own end, but she mentioned, she doesn't have a microphone. Okay. She mentions that on their Hannaford website, they have a Get Inspired tab where they offer meal builders with name and store brand and prices for people to choose the items that work in their budget. That's awesome.
Yeah, that's really neat. That's a really neat tool.
Yeah. Oh, good. We have a couple of ideas in the chat too about building meals around protein choice or building recipe inspiration around ad items, which Kelly, I know you talked a little bit about checking what's on sale, but that's another really great suggestion too.
Yeah, I agree. I think both of those kind of go back to staying really close to the store, understanding what's on sale that day. I don't know how it is at all retailers, if it's unique to the store, what's on sale, or if it's more, organization wide, but staying close to that, I think, is really helpful for our customers.
Awesome. Good. Any final questions from our audience? I'll give kind of another 30 seconds here to see if there's any final questions. Kelly, I'm not seeing anything come in. So thank you so much. And thank you to the Quaker Oats Company and Frito-Lay for sponsoring this great webinar, getting lots of good comments in the chat about how much they love this webinar. So thanks, Kelly, for putting this together. Just as a reminder, this webinar has been approved for 1 continuing education credit, and the certificate of attendance will be sent out with within the next 24 hours. And then this webinar was also recorded. So if you want to pass along the link to colleagues who might be interested in this content, the recorded version will be available on the RDBA website within the week. So thanks so much, you guys. Have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, everybody.